Right, good morning. I can hear the slight reverberation of the sound, so I would imagine you can all hear well. Well, this first slide tells you basically who I am, and as Liz in her generous words has said, I was at Cambridgeshire Archives for a long time, shall we just say, and had the good fortune there to deal principally, I suppose, within that office with the records of land drainage, which in the case of Cambridgeshire Archives are probably the finest set of land drainage records for the whole country. It was really quite an early experience of mine to go to the North Level Internal Drainage Board office, literally 40 years ago, and to see there the magnificent series of North Level IDB records, which had absorbed the records of the Duke of Bedford's Thorney estate, and from that, I suppose, my interest generated. There are, of course, significant collections elsewhere relating to the Fens. Just speaking to Rex Sly this morning, he mentioned the very extensive Bedford estate records that are at Bedford, Bedfordshire Record Office. As to, of course, there are significant collections in the University Library amongst diocesan records and so on. And let us not forget, as one can never, the records of the National Archives, from which, of course, the map that Liz has already referred to has actually been published. I'm very pleased that one of my last acts at Cambridgeshire Archives was to secure funding for better cataloguing the records of the Bedford Level Corporation, which are the best of those archives. That catalogue hasn't quite reached the online stage, but it is in the offing. It's something that my successors were able to finish. That's a very big archive. I've just made a note of the quantity, 110 linear meters or 12 cubic meters of records. Still underused. And the thing I want to come back to is that, and perhaps will emphasize, is that although I've dealt with these records, I've really only dealt with it from the perspective of an archivist and never really got into perhaps understanding them quite as much as I would wish, to understanding the content. But nevertheless, there is unquestionably a vast amount that we simply don't know, and more research needs to be done. And I hope you might feel encouraged by this presentation this morning to discover more about it. Now, okay. So first I'm going to talk about the promoters, engineers and workers. So let us first talk about the promoters. And I've started here with perhaps a bit earlier than you might expect, because I suppose when we think about the drainage of the Fens, we think principally of the great project from the 17th century onwards. But let us go back to Bishop John Morton, Bishop of Ely, 1476 to 83. And you can see on his slide here the effigy from Canterbury Cathedral, because, of course, he was subsequently Archbishop of Canterbury. It tends to be overlooked, partly, I suppose, because records of the construction of Morton's Leam from stand ground to Guy Hearn don't survive at all. I still believe that something substantial will come about. But as Clifford Darby pointed out years ago, at the very end of his medieval Fendham book, basically it was he laid down the principal model for much of the land drainage of the 17th century in terms of there being a single new, taking the shortest route, a new construction of a new drain. Here you see on the lower image Morton's Leam, still described on Hayward's map of 1604, still described there as the New Leam. Morton had constructed for him a tower at the end, which survived to the 19th century, which thereabouts, for him to look up that leam. It must have been done in his early years as bishop, because he was arrested in 1483 and was abroad for most of the rest of his episcopate, and returned only under Henry VII as to be his chancellor, and that is perhaps how he is better known. Okay, let's move on to the much more familiar figures of William Russell, or to the Russells in a general, if you might say, William Russell and his son Francis the fourth Earl of Bedford. Russell inherited the Thorney estate. He is well known because he was involved in the Low Countries with the Earl of Leicester's expeditions in the 1570s, 80s, and became governor of Flushing there. And he undoubtedly had connections with the Dutch drainers at that point, and they did bring some of them back briefly to Thorney. Sufficient for Harris, certainly, to think that he might be considered, even at sort of one remove, as one of the promoters of the eventual scheme that came about in 1630. Then there's Francis the fourth Earl, who carried on his father's ideas and was the undertaker for the drainage under the Lynn Law of 1630. Relatively recently, in 2007, in a very important article, Margaret Knittle has suggested that the design of 1631, which was generated between him and Vermeulen, was very much his design rather than Vermeulen's. So that's quite an interesting thought. And then mention of the Earl of Russell. One mustn't forget his joint promoters, the adventurers. These were the originally 13 others who signed and sealed the indenture of 14 parts in 1631. The investors who came from up and down the country. They certainly played a significant part in promoting the scheme. They were simply by producing the money. This survey from 1637 shows the way in which the land was going to be parcelled out to those investors. Each page having the name of one of the original investors at the bottom. Here, Henry Matravers. And here you can see, in fact, that section of the beside Morton's Leam, here called Morton's Leam, going down through with Thorney on the right or north to Guy Herne. This is an important survey which more work really needs to be done on. There are 3 copies surviving of it in different archives. This is the one from the Bedford Level Corporation archive. And as you can see, it lists all the land of different qualities which was going to be allotted to this one particular man. So if, for example, you can take, if you can see the number 473, I think up there, in Wisbeach Common, it matches up with 473 in that lot 18. This all being the 18th lot, which you cannot quite see at the top. The drainage of the 1630s, of course, was highly contentious and very questionable success. And then it becomes the adventurers' interests become very quickly confused, and their interests are eventually inherited by a much larger number of people who, as their various rights are split up. Here you see from the new edition of Jonas Moore's map the arms of some of the adventurers as they were, and other participants, as they are shown on the margins of Jonas Moore's map. There are something like 60 of them. I thought I'd written a note of how many there are. 83. Thank you very much, Liz. There are 83 of them, and Liz has written biographical notes on them all, which are accompanying this map. Here you've got 3 of them at the top of the map, 3 important figures. This one rather nicely next to Wisbech, John Thurlow, the Secretary of State, who of course owned Wisbech Castle, and is an interesting figure, and had became therefore inherited some of the adventurers' lands, or acquired some of the adventurers' lands. Then there are next to him Robert Hichborn and Edward Wale, both themselves regicides from the who had signed Charles I's death warrant, and had themselves very interesting histories. Tichborne, basically a London merchant and linen draper, and who was a very successful man and a fairly radical figure, but becomes at one point Lieutenant of the Tower. And then Edward Wale, one of Cromwell's major generals, who very cautiously escaped to America at the Restoration. That shows you the adventurers and participants as they were in the 1650s. To trace through the later history of the adventurers' lands, there is this amazing series of registers of the Bedford Level Corporation, which run from 1649 right up to 1920, which have amazing indexes to them, in which the transfer of all adventurers' lands is recorded. And this is a just amazing resource that needs to be explored more. To go down a level, in a sense, in terms of promoters, let's just look briefly at this man, Tycho Wing. This is one of the Duke of Bedford's agents in Thorney in the early 19th century. I'm very grateful to Tycho Wing, because it was he really who gave me that experience back in the North Level Drainage Office in 1976, because he had this series of letter books which he had written in the well, his brother and father had written before him, actually, because it was the position of agent was almost a family monopoly for a while. And he kept this most meticulous records in the North Level office, on what was, of course, the Duke's estate office. So here there is, oops, come back to him, one of those volumes of correspondence relating to the drainage of the North Level. He's an amazingly energetic person, described by the Duke of... Well, he was actually known as the King of Fens at one point, but the Duke of Bedford said that he'd immortalised himself. I don't know quite whether that was sort of tongue-in-cheek. I mean, after all, what are they to speak of, the Duke of Bedford? But he did have one of the channels of the Nene outfall named after him as Tycho Wing's channel, and indeed an area of the land which was reclaimed, known as Wingland, next to the Nene outfall. He carried on this amazing correspondence with a very large number of people, including a lot of engineers, and I'll come to one of those in a moment, and was, as you can see, himself a promoter in that he wrote publications and agitated for improvement. And here's his publication, which he published in 1840, 46 is it? 46, to promoting Sir John Rennie's plan for the middle level improvement and the drainage of Whittlesea Mere. I don't have any image of the man himself, though I suspect one might survive somewhere. But there's just this rather nice tin box, which archivists on the whole are very cautious of taking in tin boxes, but this was an exception, and it's just with his initials and name on it. Then we come to Vermeiden, perhaps the best known of all the early drainage engineers, and the man who is certainly responsible for the 1650s drainage. It's questionable whether he is, as I've said, it has been questioned whether he was responsible for the earlier scheme. But here you show his discourse. And there are a very large number of other drainage engineers involved. These are a number of reports for a number of really quite important engineers from the 18th century, almost the sort of household names of engineers who were involved. Perhaps the most significant one was Thomas Telford. Very little known quite what he was doing. In some ways it tends to be forgotten in the biographies of Telford. But if you look in the article on the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, this does to some extent correct it. And of course it was actually with, why my interest is here is that Tycho Wynne was one of his correspondents, and a lot of his publications and indeed correspondence survive in the Bedford level, in the North level records, hence you've got his name on the publication. And then again, to come down a level, one can come down to the district engineers. Here you see Mr. Abbott, the district level in South District district engineer in 1947. It really should, this is one of the photographs which were taken by the Central Office of Information for that publication Harvest Hone on the history of the floods. And it should have been his boss in the picture, but unfortunately he popped out for the day, and so he missed out on it. But this shows you in the North Level office, in the Fen office, the Bedford Level Corporation office in Ely. Well, what about the workers? Lastly, here they are on Jonas Moore's map on the left in the Arms and on Samuel Wells' map in 1827. But not just workers. I want to just say that there are a very large number of officers involved in the Bedford Level Corporation in particular. It was an enormous bureaucracy. Here you see their accounts from the mid-1660s, late 1660s. This is Edward Dalton's accounts for just the north part of the middle level. And you can see what splendid accounts they are. So it was really a very important bureaucracy. Here are some of the accounts for the 1630s for the construction of the Old Bedford. There are a very large number of papers surviving relating to that, which were purchased by the Archive Service in 2007. The point I want to make here is that you look at the names, and they are all very English names. Stevens, Nicholas, Holiday, Fordham. So the people who actually did the digging are unquestionably by English people. There were prisoners of war involved, of course we know that, from the Scots, and Samuel Wells says something about that, but I'll have to pass over that for time. If you come through into modern times, you cannot help being impressed by just the vast amount of manual labour which was involved up to very recent times. Here from the photographs from the Environment Agency, there are photographs of gangs of workers in the 1920s, and look at the picture on the right, middle level workmen endeavouring, one should say, to remove a shoal in the river Ouse by hand. What an extraordinary thing to do. How could you do it? But there you are. And lastly, just again, I thought this is rather a nice image, again from those 1947 flood images of the Ukrainian workers in the Fens still being employed in the clear-up operations for the 1947 floods. That gives you just a perspective of the things I've used, and I hope that's been of some interest as giving you an idea of some of those people who've been involved in the history of the fen drainage over the last 400 years. Okay.